After years of hurdles, delays, and legal challenges, the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion passed a critical milestone on the way to shipping bitumen from Alberta to the West Coast. The pipeline, now owned by the federal government, will ultimately be known as one of the largest single infrastructure projects in Canadian history. I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is 10-3. Calgary Herald columnist Chris Varcoe joins me to discuss what this project potentially means for the Canadian and American economies, why the process was so problematic, and what it means for other similar projects in the future. Don't forget, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So, Chris, a major Canadian project that's been in the headlines for years passed a major hurdle this week. What's the latest on the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion?
Well, Dave, the long, torturous journey to get the Trans Mountain project actually built, to get the construction finalized, is now done. Trans Mountain Corporation, which is the federal crown corporation, which is running the project, got their final leave to open certificates from the regulator, the Canada Energy Regulator, which authorized it to ship oil from its operations near Edmonton to the Westridge terminal in Burnaby. That basically means, or that essentially means now, that the mechanical completion is done, the commercial completion is done, and they will start to load tankers with oil sometime in the middle of May. The project right now, or the pipeline right now, is a little more than 70% filled with oil. That will be completed here in the next couple of weeks, and then it will actually begin moving oil to customers overseas or down in the United States.
So, for people who may not have been following the project, this has been a long road to get this pipeline approved, get this pipeline constructed, and now get this pipeline operating. How far back was, I guess, former owner now, Kinder Morgan, looking to twin this pipeline? Because this pipeline itself has a long history in Canada, right?
This pipeline was built in 1953. And yes, the history just of the expansion project goes back to the beginning of last decade. So in that 2010, 2011, 2012 timeframe. And just for a little bit of context, this was just coming off a period where the oil sands was just going like gangbusters. There were billions of dollars flowing into the oil sands, and production was increasing rapidly. And so the question became, where and how are they going to get this product to market? And that was going to be new pipelines. And this was at a time when there were several different projects that were on the go. Enbridge had the Northern Gateway project, which would have moved oil to sort of northern British Columbia for export. There was also the Keystone XL project, which was proposed to move oil down to the United States. Energy East later came up. And right around that time, 2011, 2012, Kinder Morgan began to look at expanding its pipeline project. However, they weren't looking at anything quite as large. And when I chatted with the former CEO, Ian Anderson, about it, they certainly weren't thinking that it was going to take 13 years to get it across the finish line.
Mm-hmm. And even though that pipeline under Kinder Morgan received federal approval, it wasn't a sure thing. What kind of obstacles did that company face in trying to get this thing going?
Well, there were no shortage of obstacles, and they began right from the beginning, which was which pipeline is going to go forward. Then there was all kinds of environmental opposition, and there were regulatory hearings. There were questions about First Nations consultation, and some of the First Nations and Indigenous communities along the route were opposed to it. There were delays that were done on the legal front. There was opposition from the city of Burnaby. There were obviously then construction delays when it got going. Then there was a legal delay that took almost 8 or 9 months to resolve. Then when they got going again back in 2019, the pandemic struck. They also faced issues such as getting enough staffing, wildfires, and flooding in British Columbia. It was everything but locust descended on this project, Ian Anderson said to me at one point.
And I mean, and speaking of the politics of it, as you mentioned, the city of Burnaby opposed it. This put even NDP premiers in BC and Alberta at odds with one another. At the time, it was John Horgan in BC and Rachel Notley here in Alberta. What did Rachel Notley have to say about the fight to get this built and about her thoughts on the process and getting this thing done?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even mention the interprovincial squabbling and the federal government involvement in that took place in that sort of 2017, 2018, 2019 timeframe. So at that point in time, John Horgan became the NDP premier of British Columbia, and he had promised, or his party had promised, that they were going to use every tool in the toolkit to try and stop Trans Mountain from going ahead. Then at one point, their environment minister talked about, I guess, basically trying to choke off or stop any additional shipments of bitumen coming from Alberta through British Columbia, which led to a giant fight between Alberta's NDP government under Rachel Notley and Horgan's government in British Columbia. There was a wine ban that Premier Notley introduced. Then they were going to introduce legislation to potentially turn off the taps. So when I talked to former Premier Notley about this a few days ago, she said, if British Columbia was going to do something that Alberta thought was clearly illegal in trying to prevent trade and trying to prevent a landlocked province like Alberta to get its product to the coast, then they were going to look at sort of a tit for tat kind of situation. And that's why they looked at to potentially turning off the taps to BC. So it became this sort of, I guess, enormous political battle. And then that was at the point where Kinder Morgan said, there is way too much uncertainty here for us. Our investment thesis is not at all what it was before. We can't build this project through the courts. And they sort of threw up their hands and said, we're going to have to look at walking away if this can't be resolved. At that point, the federal government got involved, and that led to the federal government buying this project in May of 2018 for about $4.4 billion.
Walk us through how that transpired. Like you mentioned that there was a lot of uncertainty around the project that made Kinder Morgan kind of unsure or, maybe not seeing it as worth the risk. Was it a factor of things? Was it the politics of it? Was it the laborious process to get it approved? And then even the fights after approval, was it concern that it may get blocked in the courts? Or was it a cost thing? Or was it a combination of all those things? And then how do we go from them saying, all right, well, we're not really sure about this, to the federal government deciding that it's an investment that they want to take on? Were there no other investors at that point?
Yeah, I would say all of the above took place in terms of why Kinder Morgan was prepared to walk away from the project. As I said, at one point, their CEO told an analyst call that we can't get this project built through the court. We can't reconcile interprovincial squabbling. And there's way too much uncertainty here for us and our investors. There's just too much risk for us to put in this project. And at that point in time, the price of that project was only $7.4 billion. And as we know, it went all the way up to $34 billion. So the risk on the project was just too great for them. And that's where Prime Minister Trudeau got together with the two provincial premiers. They had a series of negotiations, and Kinder Morgan realized, and they went and they tried to talk to potential investors, and nobody wanted to touch the project, Anderson told me. So it was going to take government to get this built. And at that point, there was talk about the provincial government of Alberta buying the project. But of course, they wouldn't have had all of the potential levers that the federal government would have to get this project built. It's an interprovincial pipeline. So that's where the Trudeau government decided to buy the project, and then they were going to move forward and finally get it done.
We'll be right back. And so we have federal approval. We have the feds as a willing buyer, maybe a reluctantly willing buyer. But even after they bought the pipeline, the whole thing hit its own snag in the form of a federal court ruling. What happened there?
Well, timing is really critical here to remember. So in May of 2018, the federal government bought the project. Then in August, I believe it was August the 25th, construction actually began on twinning of the pipeline. 5 days later, the Kinder Morgan shareholders approved this sale formally to the federal government. And the very next day, the Federal Court of Appeal came down with a ruling on the project. It had been challenged in the courts, and the federal court came in and nullified the project's permits due to what it said was inadequate consultation with Indigenous communities and improper consideration of the oil tanker traffic caused by the project. So at that point, the project had no permits, and the federal government had to decide to go back and redo the Indigenous consultation and also resolve the issues on the oil tanker traffic issues. So that was a huge hurdle, and I think a real sort of pivotal moment of what was going to happen with the future of the Trans Mountain Pipeline.
And so what had to go into getting that done? Did they have to go back to First Nations communities, hold new, consultation hearings? Did they have to do new environmental assessments on the coast regarding tanker traffic? And what did the minister who was responsible for this at the time have to say?
Well, the minister at the time was Edmonton MP Amarjeet Sohi. And when I asked him about it a few days ago, I said, what was that moment like? And he said, it felt like someone had punched me in the gut. He said, my reaction was, my God, we've really screwed up the consultation. And so he realized that they were in big trouble. And he had a conversation with the Prime Minister. They decided to have to redo the entire consultation process. They brought in a former federal justice to help oversee it at the time. They went back and did a number of hearings in the communities and tried to actually have sort of proper consultation involving the policymakers, not just the bureaucrats, but actually involving the politicians. That was one of the big differences. They also had to resolve the issue of the marine traffic and what was going to be required to get that across the finish line. They eventually did. And then the federal government reapproved the project and it got regulatory approval. It got its permits back and the construction finally began again for a second time in 2019.
And even then it wasn't necessarily...
No, it wasn't
an easy road, right? Like, I mean, you spoke with Ian Anderson, the former head of the Trans Mountain Corporation, and you also spoke with the new head of the Trans Mountain Corporation. Like, what was the construction process like, and what did they run into during that period?
Well, and this is kind of sort of more, maybe one of the more curious points that gets overlooked is that this is a really tricky piece of construction, of engineering. And when I talked to Dawn Farrell, the current CEO of Trans Mountain, she pointed that out, is that you're going through all kinds of difficult terrain. And it wasn't like in 1953 where you had to have all kinds of consideration for waterways, for the territories that you were going through, for the animals, the species at risks. Like there was just all kinds of additional complexities and technology that had to be adopted into this. And even recently, even over the last 6 and 8 months, they were going through the final leg of construction near Hope, and they were having difficulty getting the final pieces of pipe through the ground without sort of dealing with all these water that would come into it. So they had to go back to the regulator and get separate approval to use a slightly smaller piece of pipe to get through this sort of trenching. If it had gone wrong, if the drill had failed, it would have set them back months and months and millions of dollars. So that had to be resolved. Then they also had labor productivity issues because there were 2 other major projects being built at that time in British Columbia, the Site C Dam as well as the Coastal GasLink project. So there was a real competition to get workers at that moment in time. And as I said, they had all these sort of environmental issues, or land issues rather, dealing with wildfires in British Columbia and then flooding in British Columbia. So it just seemed that they had to run a huge gauntlet just to get the project built.
So now it's built, it's ready to operate. What's at stake for Canada? Or what is the potential benefit for Canada? I imagine that Alberta's premier is quite happy to see it finally done. We can move Alberta oil out to the coast and I believe get perhaps a fairer or better price for our resources. What's at stake for the Alberta's bottom line, and I guess as Canada as a whole?
Well, for Canada and for the provincial government, this is going to mean more revenues. So there's 2 ways to sort of view this project, I guess, financially. One is the fact that it's going to cost at least $33 or $34 billion to complete. That is an enormous sum of money when you consider the fact that it was $5 billion initially when we go back to that 2011-2012 timeframe. But there's obvious economic benefits here in that it will allow Canada to get a better price for its oil, particularly its heavy oil. Studies have shown that the project's going to generate about $1 billion annually in additional federal tax revenue and $4 billion a year to Alberta, according to Farrell. And then there's the greater returns for producers. They're going to get a better netback on their oil or a smaller discount that will be impacted by that. And that will lead to more reinvestment. So economists like Trevor Tombe and others have argued that the payback on this is going to be well in excess of the $34 billion that it took to build this project.
Mm-hmm. And talking about the $34 billion to build that project, like how does a project go from $5 billion, like a little over a decade ago, to $34 billion? Where did that cost come from? And then is the federal government kind of stuck with that bill? Is there talk about selling the pipeline to defray the costs? And even if they wanted to, who would buy it?
Well, first off, the question of why did it get to be $34 billion is one that's going to be studied for years. But as I say, you go back to 2012, $5 billion. I don't think anyone there ever envisioned that it was going to take this long. And time is money, particularly when you start to build a project. Then you have to stand down everyone for 9 or 10 months. Then you restart the project. Then you have to pause it again due to some of the natural disasters that were going on in British Columbia at that time. So time is money, and it certainly is money for the investors as they're trying to get this project through. But there were also, critically, a lot of scope changes that took place. Anderson pointed out that they brought in best-in-class, world-scale technology on leak detection and other things along that line. He says this is going to be the best, safest pipeline built in the world. So all of those things added costs onto the process. There's no doubt about that. Now, in terms of recouping the money, we talked a little bit about the tax side of it and the additional investment that this will generate. The other point is the federal government is going to try and sell this project. They've always said they would sell it back to the private sector as long as the project was de-risked. In other words, once they actually got it built, they got all the tolls in place and everything was operating. There is interest in buying this project, but undoubtedly there's going to have to be some sort of reckoning on just how they deal with the $34 billion. The federal government, most analysts think, are going to have to take some write down on this in order to try and sell it. But the project does have good cash flow, assured cash flow coming from long-term contracts with shippers, some of the largest oil and gas companies in Canada. So there will be interest on that front. And there's also the component here for Indigenous ownership. And there's several groups that are interested in buying it. That, I think, is going to be what will transpire. And that will be the conversations we're going to be watching for over the next, I would say, 1 or 2 years.
Now, there are a lot of people who see this as a boon for Alberta, a boon for Canada. But even during the planning and the construction process, there were people saying we don't need another pipeline. We don't need to ship that much bitumen, that it's not as rosy a project as some people may have you believe. Are there still naysayers or detractors around Trans Mountain as a whole, or even, the notion of expanding other oil infrastructure in Canada?
There are no shortage of naysayers on this project and on building additional energy infrastructure to move oil, to export oil. And there's a lot of people saying that this is going to be a stranded asset at some point in time, that, a project like this doesn't pay for itself in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. It will take, several decades. I mean, these contracts are 20-year contracts, and the project will be in place for years beyond that. And the question is, when will it run full? How long will it run full? How quickly is the payback? So those are things that people are going to be watching for. In terms of, do we need more pipelines? I think if you talk to people in the industry, they point out that, look, if Western Canada has egress, there is oil here, they will increase production. But the question really becomes, who would take on a new project, given what the track record was of this project? And bear in mind that this was a success in the sense that it actually got built. Keystone XL, they spent a lot of money and it didn't get completed due to political reasons. Northern Gateway, they spent a lot of money trying to get that project built and it didn't get completed. Same thing with Energy East. So finding private sector investors willing to put money into pipeline construction in Canada, I'm just not sure who would do that today.
Yeah, I mean, it raises the whole process raises interesting questions about the ability or appetite to get some of these projects done. But in this case, it eventually became a success and will start operating soon. Chris, thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest, Chris Varcoe. More from him at calgaryherald.com. I'm Dave Breakenridge. Thanks for listening.